This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome into The Camp. I'm Zach Heilprin. That is the Athletics' Jesse Temple. Well, the last time we talked, we thought we were going to get to see two more practices. Jesse, that did not happen. Wisconsin decided to close the final two practices, Friday's practice and Saturday's practice. So the last one we got to see was Thursday. We already talked about it, so we can't really go back and talk about it again. However, Luke Fickell did speak this morning with the media after Saturday's practice and had a few updates, specifically in regards to Will Pauling, who went down with an injury in Thursday's practice.
He described Will as a quick healer and said that he was optimistic that he'd be in a position here down the road. I think Luke didn't necessarily want to go into great detail about the injury situation, but I did feel it was noteworthy to ask him. And he also talked about how Will last year, when he got hurt at Cincinnati, was expected to be out 8 to 10 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks, according to Fickell, and by week 5 was ready to go. Obviously, it's a different situation, but certainly that would be encouraging for Badgers fans based on what happened on Thursday. And Wisconsin certainly looks like it'll have its top 6 wide receivers in play as we are now 3 weeks out from the opener.
And he also talked about Jack Pugh, who was not at practice on Thursday, dealing with a family matter, but could be back with the team very soon because they need tight ends. We know that is the case. They've been dealing with injuries at the position. They dealt with guys leaving. So I thought the one other thing that he talked about in regards to the tight ends was Tucker Ashcraft, a guy we've talked about, and he came out and straight up said he's going to play this year.
He had a lot of praise for Ashcraft, and we mentioned before that suddenly began getting reps with the first team offense, and you're looking at your roster going 38, is that right? And it was. And the thing that I think was most interesting that Luke said was he's kind of got the body type and the skill set of the body type of the tight ends that we may have used here in the past, but the skill set of what we're looking for out of the tight ends in the future, which is quite a mix. And I think we've seen that, right? He's got the physicality, but he's also got a tremendous ability to catch passes. And Luke even said this is a West Coast kid. They didn't know a ton about him, obviously. Everything came together so quickly. Tucker decommitted from Colorado in December, then took that official to Wisconsin, and all of a sudden he's signed, and now he's up here. And so he's emerged. Every year, it's always the preseason is so interesting because you never know which true freshmen are going to suddenly emerge. And he was one that I certainly would not have picked out of that group. But as Fickell said, he's going to play this year. He's going to have a role.
Who's the guy that jumped, like just thinking about this, you said that where it's always interesting to see who is going to step up and show out as part of that freshman class because you just never really know. Is there a guy that stands out in your memory? Like, I can't believe he ended up standing out. I mean, there's a few for me and I don't want to take yours, but Keanu Benton's one of them. I think we've been pretty much on record as saying how wrong we were about that. At least I am on record as saying is how wrong I was about that day one, saying, oh, he's never going to play. And he ends up starting how many games? And then I think the other one obviously is Jonathan Taylor too. But do you have any others that stand out?
Those would be two that definitely come to mind.
Sorry.
And the Taylor situation. Oh, you're all good, Zach. It's always good to know that we're like minds. What do they say? Great minds think alike. I don't know if we're great minds, but at least we think alike sometimes. People might like it more when we disagree more, so we should probably fight and argue. I'll try to come up with some counterpoints. But Taylor's situation,
I'll just start taking contrarian point of views and see what we can do.
Taylor's situation was unique because in all the open practices that we saw those first couple of weeks, hardly ever saw him. And I remember getting asked a question on a local radio station about him. And I was like, I don't know. I don't see it because we had not seen him at all. And as we know, 2 weeks before the opener, they had that infamous night practice in Camp Randall when he just destroyed the first team defense. And people were looking around thinking, well, either we're going to suck on defense or he's unbelievable. And it turned out he was unbelievable. There's also certain times where you just know a guy is going to contribute right away because he's physically ridiculous. I mean, Leo Chanel, even though it was in Grantsburg and maybe weren't quite sure how it was going to translate right away, he looked the part. Nick Herbig looked the part. Yeah. So it's both ways. But with Tucker Ashcraft, definitely didn't see it coming. Obviously, we didn't know until right when preseason began that they wouldn't have two guys we expected to be in that top 4 group with Jack Eschenbach and Clay Cundiff deciding to move on from the program.
I'm trying to think of any others that stand out. That quote you had about do we suck? I remember Chris Orr telling that story a bunch of times, and he tells it so much better than anybody else can, because he gets like the high voice about, I thought we were gonna suck. And it's it's that's not a very good Chris Orr impression, but it was amazing. Way to tell the story. Who else? I'm trying. Gosh, the Herbig one's interesting because we didn't get to see practice that year. It was 2020 in fall camp, but
that's right.
But what we heard from everybody, it was two guys that stood out. They're going to play a bunch, right? It was going to be Nick Herbig and it was going to be Chimere Dike, and they both ended up playing a ton that year. Now the injuries obviously played a huge role in Chimere's spot because of what they were without Kendrick Pryor and Danny Davis for large stretches of that year. Herbig was just really, really good, and and it obviously showed up. But yeah, it's always interesting. I might have to go back and look at that a little bit closer. Was there anything else that Luke Fickell talked about before we get into Xavier Lucas's commitment yesterday?
No, nothing that I think is pertinent for the show. Some stories I might be working on, but we can talk about those down the road.
All right. I won't divulge any of it then, because I don't want anybody not to subscribe to The Athletic. Do you guys have any deals going on these days?
I'm sure we always have something going on. I'm biased.
Dollar for 12. Isn't it
it's worth it anyway?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Go check it out. And Jesse's worth it on just his stories alone, but you get so much else as well. So Xavier Lucas, he has committed to Wisconsin. We kind of talked about it when we did the show on Thursday. We were kind of expecting it. What is Wisconsin getting in Xavier Lucas?
Well, depending on which website you look at, he's either 6'1.5", 6'1", 6'2". He'll probably fall somewhere in the middle when he actually gets here. But let's say he is 6'1" or 6'2" and grows to that. To me, it's another in a line of these kind of lanky, taller defensive backs that Wisconsin has been going after under the new staff. And the other thing is speed. It's speed and athleticism. His track numbers are really good down in Florida. He made the regionals in the 100. It was a sub 11-second 100. He was a part of a 4x100 relay team and a 4x400 relay team that qualified for the state track meet during his junior season. So those are certainly characteristics you can't teach. And his recruitment was really interesting because he would be the first to acknowledge that Florida State was a school that he was really interested in. But Florida State, if you look at their recruiting board and who they ended up getting, had some other guys that they considered to be more highly regarded or people they felt fit better. They've got 2 5-star defensive backs committed in that 2024 class. And I know Florida State just had a decommit, I believe a DB flipped to Alabama, but there were still 3, 4, 5 other guys that were considered 4-star prospects that Florida State was interested in. And so at a certain point, you got to evaluate your options. And Xavier did take 5 official visits, none of them to Florida State. Went to Iowa and Wisconsin and Illinois, and those were really considered to be the ones that were in strongest position. But Wisconsin managed to fend those other schools off. I know I mentioned this on the previous show, Zach, but I believe Iowa had gone 100% on its official visitors. So for Wisconsin to be able to pull that off says a lot about what they showed Lucas and how he can fit into this DB room. And now Wisconsin's sitting there with 21 committed prospects, which is right in the sweet spot of what Fickell said he wants in a typical class. He said 18 to 22 high school kids, and Lucas is one of 3 cornerbacks. I think he's listed as a safety in the 24/7 composite, but Wisconsin, to my knowledge, views him as a corner. So he'd be coming in with Jay Harper and Emilio Agar, the 4-star corner out of Philly.
So it's interesting. You talk about the 100 times sub 11. The only number I can always remember is Jonathan Taylor's from high school. I think he ran like a 10.49, and he obviously won the state title there in New Jersey. So that's always my point of reference in how fast something is. So anything sub 11 is very, very fast. And obviously that's what Lucas is bringing to the table. So it's another good get. And again, we talked about it on Thursday in terms of how they want to turn over that room, how they wanted to turn over that room and turn over and mine the talent in that room. And that continues with the addition of Xavier Lucas in the class of 2024. So, all right. I asked for questions a couple days ago, said I was going to be doing a Q&A episode. Because of the way the things happen with Wisconsin, pushing practice off and not pushing practice off, but not allowing us in for Friday and Saturday's practice. I wanted to push this off, bring Jesse in because we'd have a little bit more to talk about, and we do. So I got plenty of questions. We'll start with this one. I kind of joked with you about this the other day, and I'm gonna ask it. Duke Van Elk, he says, now that we can watch the podcast on YouTube, one thing is clearly evident. Jesse can sit very, very still. It's kind of eerie, actually. How often during recording do you think that Jesse's video must be frozen, only to have him blink or slightly move his eyes?
These YouTube shows are new to me, and initially I was thinking like, okay, how can I make sure I'm not darting around too much? I don't want to be obnoxious to the viewer, but now that I know that, maybe I just need to be a little bit more expressive, gesticulate a lot more, like, move my computer around like that, ruin everything for you. So it's a learning process.
That's the thing. This is not a comfortable thing for us, I don't think. So prior to doing the YouTube shows, we would still use Zoom to do our shows, but we wouldn't do the video. We wouldn't even see each other. So we were just looking at blank screens. And so you could kind of do whatever you wanted. This is a little bit different. This isn't overly comfortable, but here we are. So
we're getting better. We're getting used to it. We're rolling along now.
Yes, for sure. He actually had a real question, so I'll get to that one.
I'm eagerly anticipating the actual question.
Luke Fickell, he says, seems to continually stress competition in practice. Has there been a noticeable difference this year with the new staff, or is it just a bit of coaching cliche?
Well, what we see at the start of practice is new, and I think it's really exciting and interesting. And Luke actually did talk about that on Saturday after practice too, how important it was to create competition in different areas. We're seeing the quarterback, they take the snap from the 5-yard line, and it's wide receiver versus DB, and it is fun to watch. But they do some other things. They match up the O-line against the D-line and have them push each other back, and everybody's encircling them. And then Wisconsin's done stuff like that before. I mean, how fondly we must remember the Oklahoma drills of yesteryear when dudes were just smacking into. They would just, you might as well just put 2 Chanel brothers in there and let them go at it. So they've done stuff like that before, but we've seen some different types of drills, and it's something that Fickell obviously wants to create is a competition right away at practice to let everybody lock in and to understand what it's going to be like for the next 2+ hours.
Would you say it's a carryover from what they did in the weight room? And
yeah,
in the summer and in the winter conditioning?
In terms of competition in general, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I did the big feature on Brady Collins, the new strength coach, and one of the biggest things he wanted to create was competition. But the funny thing is, he came up with competitions basically out of thin air. He was telling me he would do this basically every time. You go into that weight room, there's a basketball hoop in there, dunk contests break out. They will turn anything into a competition. They'll play a game of cards. He'll have, like a Madden type thing going, and it'll just be overtime and who can win. And there was one day in there where he just came up with a game on the fly where he created a shuffleboard situation. He used some duct tape and duct taped the floor and put 2.5-pound weights in there and had it was baseball bats. And that's kind of one of the pillars of this Luke Fickell program, and what he established at Cincinnati is everything is about competition. It doesn't matter what it is. And the good news is Wisconsin has a bunch of dudes who embrace that and want that, because you're a competitor to begin with, but you've also, if you've been a part of the program last 3 years, you know what the results have been on the field. So you do whatever you can to make sure that you're as good as you can be when the season begins.
Yeah, I remember talking to Brady when I had him and the entire strength staff on, talking about how you come up with those competitions. And it's like, do you just lay in bed at night and think about this? Like, how do these competitions come along? And he's like, no, they just pop it in my head. I'll just be doing something. I'll see something and it pops in my head and we're going to do it. And the guys just never know what's coming. I think it has to be exciting for both his staff and for the kids, because you just never know what to expect on a day going in. I think we've hammered home the idea, the previous staff, you had this little card, your little 3x5 card that you would take in there, and you would know exactly what was expected out of you. You would do your lift and then you would leave. And there's a lot of unexpected things as a part of what Brady Collins does. And I think that kind of keeps them on their toes. And we heard it with Luke Fickell when they went down to Platteville. He didn't want to go and see what Platteville was before he went down there, because he wanted to be kind of like the players and walking into a situation where it's a little bit unfamiliar. and a little uncomfortable and have to adjust on the fly. And I think that's also a part of this whole thing.
Here's something else that I think is noteworthy that I thought of, and I didn't include this in the story, but I know that Fickell and Brady Collins have talked about this as well. Brady's obviously coming in there trying to change things up, but he's kicking their ass every day, doing really difficult things. And it would be very easy for a bunch of kids who've been around for a long time to be like, what is this guy trying to do? Or be a little hesitant or reluctant to embrace it. And after those sessions, the players are coming up and hugging him and thanking him. And I think that's notable just because it shows how hungry this group is to want to change things. And that's not to say that they didn't appreciate and enjoy the previous staff. They spent so much time around them. But I think that says something about how this has come together so quickly in terms of the players embracing this new staff and wanting to do whatever it is to push themselves to be better.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of in this same vein, Buffy Badger asks, what are the differences and similarities you guys have noticed between Luke Fickell's and Paul Chryst fall practices? I think we've kind of hit on some of the differences. Are there any similarities that you notice?
It's still football.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're still doing 11 on 11.
That.
They're still doing 11 on 11. They're still doing Skelly. They do things a little bit differently when it comes to the Skelly. We kind of talked about it before, where it's one side of the field, and the getting as many reps as possible when they go to 11 on 11 and putting some of the young guys at the other end of the field and working two things at the same time. Though I think at times under Paul Chryst, they did that as well. So the similarities are it still comes down to the same drills. Everyone's doing the same drills. It's just little tweaks here and there.
Yeah, I think it's the way they get into things that is obviously different, which people will see with the offense and the defense. And there are certain drills that maybe you didn't necessarily see under the previous staff, but that's because they're running something different. So they are trying to work on specific things that just wasn't a part of the offense previously. And that doesn't mean one system or a way of thought is better and one is worse. It's just a lot different in terms of how they're going to be getting into things. And as a result, the way they practice is different.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Tony asks, any concerns that our offensive line underperformed last year, couldn't protect Graham Mertz when defenses were playing the run, and now will be passing more?
I think it's going to be a concern until they can put it on film and show they can be dominant. And I don't know what this looks like this season. We've talked about that before. They have, to my eye, done a very good job here this preseason and opening up some big holes for the running backs. And in terms of pass protection, they're doing some things a little bit differently. But to me, this group that we're going to see in the rotation, yeah, they're still big dudes, but they've got the athleticism that is required to succeed in this offense. I don't know whether they'll be more successful. I don't think they'll be less successful because there were a lot of struggles. It's a different way to get into things. And I think that they've got an opportunity to succeed, but we've been saying for the last 3 years that the offensive line had the talent. So, what is it? Is it coaching? Is it scheme? And we're going to find out this year.
Yeah, we will. Kind of in the same vein, Malden Badger asks, how has the run defense looked? And you just kind of talked about some of the big holes that have popped open.
There have been some big holes, but I also think for every time we talk about the offense giving it to the defense is giving it right back. So I don't want to make it sound like the defense is just folding like a broken tent or something like that. There have been numerous instances I can think of, even in this past week, like a James Thompson Jr. coming in, bursting into the backfield. We talked earlier in the week, he had 2 tackles for loss in a 3-play span. And then maybe it was on Thursday, had a couple other big plays. So it's coming from everywhere, and they are running so many more plays as they will in a game, but just like in practice. So that lends itself to more playmaking opportunities for both sides. So, I think the run defense from what we've seen has been good at times, and there's obviously a lot of playmakers that can be a part of that.
To me, it's going to be a big wait and see, because we know what the defense looked like when Keanu Benton was not on the field last year, especially run defense wise. And I think that remains a big question. Who is going to fill that role? Keanu made his debut on Friday night for Pittsburgh and dominated in his very short little stint on the field. So did Nick Herbig, for that matter. A couple Badgers. I was joking. I put it on Twitter, but some people were calling Pittsburgh, Wisconsin East, because they have so many former Badgers out there, and I would agree. And it made me it reminded me that I ran into a scout from Pittsburgh when they were down in Platteville, and I asked him, don't you have enough Badgers out there already? And he goes, we want more. So Keanu is a big, big hole to fill, and they don't necessarily have the one guy that's going to do it. Pass rushing wise, my biggest concern is whether they can hold up against the run without him on the field, because it wasn't always the greatest when he wasn't on the field last year. That remains a concern for me. I'm not going to put a ton of stock into what we see in practice in terms of run defense, because you just never know. And it could just be amazing offensive line play, or it could be just really poor defensive line play, or linebackers not filling the right gaps, or whatever it is. I'm going to wait and see until the game's to one way or the other.
I think it's notable that they're trying to find 8 defensive linemen to rotate in. And Fickell even discussed this earlier in the week, that they know they lost Keanu Benton. It's going to be more of a by committee situation this year, and that's understandable. To me, the top 4 at this point are, you got Gio Pies and Isaiah Mullins, who've done a lot of the 2 work, and Rodis Johnson and James Thompson Jr., but there's at least 5 other guys that they're putting in there. And I don't know what the rep distribution is going to look like, but when you try to put 8 guys in there, that says something about the fact that you don't know whether you've got that singular dominant person. So we'll see.
Colby asks, what do you think the base defense will be? He says next year. I assume he means this year, but I think it's going to be a 3-4, 3-3-5, 4-2-5. And Matt asks, will we see any 3-4 this year? I'll answer that one first. We're going to see the 3-4 this year. In terms of the base defense, their base defense has essentially been a 4-2-5 for the last few years. But this is going to be a little bit different because of the dollar package. I think the dollar ends up being their base defense.
I always, when people ask this question, like, there's base defense and then the defense they play the most, right?
But that's what I'm saying. Like, the base defense, it's irrelevant because it's not the one that ends up being played the most. They've been a base 3-4 defense for the 10 years, and they have not played a majority of 3-4 defense during that 10 year, probably at any point in that 10 years. It's always the 4-2-5 where you have 5 DBs on the field, but I don't think it's going to be 4-2-5. I think it's going to be the dollar package. Yeah,
I did a story on this earlier in the offseason, but if you just look at the kind of advanced stats that take all this into account, like Wisconsin, the defense Wisconsin used the most last season had, 5 DBs on the field. And I guess it was 2-4-5.
2-4-5, but it's yeah, I guess you can say 2-4-5, but those outside linebackers more often than not were coming.
Right. I think that's how you got to come up with the numbers in some capacity. And whereas under Tressel at Cincinnati, it was, 3-3-5. So I don't know what percentage of plays we're going to have the 6 DBs on the field. And I think some of it depends on the teams that they're playing, but that would be a good bet that you're going to see that an awful lot.
Yeah. I mean, technically, I guess you could call it a 3-3-5. The dollar package, right? Because it's 2 defensive linemen, but you have an outside linebacker, essentially CJ Getz with his hand in the ground.
Right.
And then you have the 2 inside linebackers, but you also have, whether it's Hunter Wohler or Preston Zachman or whoever it is, up there acting as another linebacker. So that's your 3rd linebacker. And then you have 5 DBs, including 2 more safeties.
Yeah. Some of this is maybe semantics.
Yeah.
Because what they're doing in the dollars, they take one of the outside linebackers out, and so the other one is probably on the line, and Hunter Wohler moves up to linebacker depth. But the interesting thing about the defense is they've got so many different players that they can use in that. There could be a situation where you've got the 3 inside linebackers on the field together, and that's how they want to play it, because they consider Jake Chaney to be a starter, and he certainly looks like that in the preseason. So it's going to be something like that. Like, very rarely, I think, will you see 3 defensive linemen on the field. Now, you will when they need to bow up, probably, goal line situation type. But I think there are certain personnel packages that you're going to see way more of. And obviously that dollar one gives them a lot of flexibility and versatility.
It does. So a couple questions about the wide receivers. Dave asks, any worry in the cornerback room, or are the wide receivers just that good?
Again, for as much as we talk about the big plays the wide receivers make, they're running way more plays, they're passing way more. And I do think that the corners have, especially that top group, given it right back. Now, that's not to say there haven't been some big time plays made by the wide receivers. I know you don't want to make too much of these preseason practices, rightfully so, because we want to see what happens in a game. But I mean, Ricardo Hallman in the spring, what did he have? 6 interceptions in a 2-practice stretch. Alexander Smith, to me, has been the most, this preseason, to me, has been the best corner from the group in terms of playmaking, breaking up passes. And Jason Maitre is super physical, the biggest talker in the group. So I think that 3 has really established itself very well in the preseason.
I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't disagree at all. It's a give and take. I will just say that the wide receivers, more than in past years, have been making more plays because they simply have been passing the ball a lot more and be given a lot more opportunities and running more plays. So there have been more opportunities for them to go out and show us some of the playmaking ability they have, which leads us to tweet about it, leading fans to wonder whether the cornerback room is in trouble.
I'm interested in the backups, though, really. I mean, how many reps are those guys going to get? Jonas Duclona, man, for a true freshman, you come in as an early enrollee, you establish yourself in the second team. He hasn't let up at all. Jace Arnold has dropped a little bit to the 3s, but that's because they brought in Nazir Forkurine, who's really, to me, come along really well here these last couple practices. And they've still got Owen Arnett in the slot with the number 2. So you can't rely just on 3 cornerbacks the entire game, but I don't know. I don't know and Jim Leonard obviously loved to play as many DBs as he could. So, I mean, it remains to be seen what that looks like with Paul Haynes, Mike Tressel, and what Colin Hitchler likes out of his safeties. But those guys are going to play, those reserves.
Was he asked, Colin Hitchler was asked, how many safeties can you have on the field at a time? Because there's so many guys that you kind of would love to have out there, a lot more than, not a lot more than anybody else, but bunch of guys you'd love to have out there. Travion Blaylock, Kamoi Latu, Austin Brown, Hunter Wohler, Preston Zachman. Like, you can go on down the list of guys, and I'm sure I'm leaving someone out, but they all have made plays, and you would feel good about putting them on the field if they need them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Preston and Austin have been really good with the 2s, and Travion, it's interesting because I look at that safety group like I do the inside linebackers, and I imagine that the staff does too. They've got 3 starters, and a lot of times all 3 are going to be on the field in that dollar package when Wohler's playing at linebacker depth. And when there's only 2 on the field, generally what we've seen, I would say, is Latu and Wohler, but you also get Blaylock and Wohler. And Blaylock's played in 25 games. Obviously, he missed last year with the ACL, but he's an experienced guy. He's been around. He's been here forever. So they're going to rely on those 3 a lot, but Zachman and Brown, they've made plays too, like you said.
Yeah. My biggest question with Travion is obviously his health. Can he stay healthy? And you talk about the games he's played in. He hasn't played a ton of defense, though, right? You have the numbers. I don't have the numbers in front of me. Pro Football Focus, I'm sure, has them. Most of that's special teams, right?
Probably. I don't have the numbers in front of me. One of the big differences, by the way, with us having to be on video is I don't have my laptop up staring at it while we're having a conversation. So I don't have access to it right now.
I got you. All right. So staying with this wide receiver theme, who are the top 3 receivers in camp?
That's a good question, because I think the top 3 receivers in camp may not be the 3 that have been.
I would agree.
And I imagine we're going to go in the same place here. Because the top 3, and I wrote about this week too, they've basically been rotating in like it's a hockey shift where they go 3 in, 3 out. But the first 3 that we've been seeing, Chimere Dike and CJ Williams on the outside with Will Pauling in the slot. And then the next 3 are Keontez Lewis and Bryson Green on the outside with Skylar Bell in the slot. Bryson Green, to me, is just the physicality, the ability to rip the ball out of the air on 50-50 balls. And I don't even know if it's fair to call him 50-50 balls because he's just going to go get them. He's been absolutely one of the 3 best. I don't know what that means for reps. That's not to say that CJ Williams hasn't taken advantage of his opportunities, but I don't know that he's gotten targeted quite as many times as some of these other wide receivers. And CJ was the standout of spring ball because he was destroying second and third team DBs. So to me, and that's interesting because they play the same spot, or at least they put him in the same spot right now. So Bryson to me has been one of the best.
I would agree with that. I also think because of who else is on the field when CJ's on the field, it kind of does limit his opportunities, because the other two guys that he's usually out there with, Chimere Dike and Will Pauling, are very much favorited targets right now for Tanner Mordecai. Would you not agree with that? And
I agree 100%.
And then you think behind him, when it's Bryson Green in there with, sometimes it's Tanner, sometimes it's Braden Locke, the other two guys, Skylar Bell and Keontez Lewis, and those guys are both making plays, but it's kind of tended to go towards Bryson Green a little bit more. So I think it's also some of the other guys are on the field. Maybe that's why CJ isn't necessarily targeted as much as we had seen in the spring, but Bryson Green has to be in the top three. I'd probably throw Chimere and I'd probably throw Will Pauling in there. That'd probably be my top three.
That's probably where I'm at too. And then in the last practice we had an opportunity to see, which we discussed on the last show, Chimere was everywhere. It seemed like he caught every ball that was thrown his way. I mentioned the first one in 11-on-11s was a 34-yard gain where he was off balance, leapt in the air, got popped by a safety and managed to hang on. I mean, he's been consistent all the way throughout. We know what Phil Longo said at the preseason local media day, that he said other than his wife and kids, he probably loves slot receivers more than anybody else. And that's very evident when you look at what he did at North Carolina. Now, obviously, he had a guy named Josh Downs, and Wisconsin doesn't have a Josh Downs right now, but that doesn't mean they can't have big time productive playmakers. And I certainly expect that out of Pauling and Bell. But because of how he likes to operate, and because slot receivers have the ball in the middle of the field and can do a lot of damage on either side, Pauling's been getting targeted a ton. So that's a really great point that you're bringing up. And the more you see of Bryson Green, the harder it is to think that he's not going to get a good number of reps and opportunities down the field. For sure. And he initiated a new thing for players. He did an opening statement for himself when we had an opportunity to talk to him. I've never seen a player do that before he introduced himself, because it was the first time we had a chance to talk to him since he came in from Oklahoma State. I wonder if that was a thing down there. And then that's just what he brought to Wisconsin. So that was good. That was a fun interview. He's a good interview. So which is something we always love. We love guys that are good talkers and give you interesting quotes. And that's exactly what Bryson Green did. I'll finish with this quick one here for the wide receivers. I think it's a very, very quick one. I don't think we have to think about it or talk about it too much. Where does this wide receiver room rank among the other Badger wide receiver rooms of the last decade? Brats and Chasers asked that. So I feel like it's premature to make this declaration that it's the best, because there was a pretty good one where Quintez Cephas was ridiculous. And they had four really good receivers. And Kendrick Pryor, Danny Davis, even AJ Taylor did a lot of damage out of the slot. Was it 10 years? Because that doesn't include the Russell Wilson team that had Jared Aberdeen, Nick Toon catching a million passes. Right. Yeah. I think ultimately this is going to be number one. I think it will be as well. What would they call that in 2019? It was the fearsome foursome. I think that's what it was. But go back and look at the stats, and you brought this up a ton of times, how much how much Quintez was targeted that year compared to everybody else, and it wasn't even close. I don't think we're going to see something like that. No. They may not have a one as good as Chimere, or I'm going to keep on doing this. I suck. They may not have a one as good as Quintez. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just not saying them for sure that they do. The rest of it, the six, and then behind them, right? Chris Brooks Jr. and Tommy McIntosh and Vinny Anthony. The depth of the room is from top to bottom as good as it's ever been. Do they have a 1-2 punch of a Jared Aberdeen and Nick Toon? I don't think so. I mean, those are two really good NFL receivers, especially Jared. If he had not gotten the concussion issue, I think he would have been even better. And same, obviously, Nick Toon dealt with some injuries as well. But from top to bottom, it's hard to say that this won't end up being the best. And I'm okay with saying that right now, that it is the best. But yeah, from what I remember about that 2019 season, writing about it, and this is from memory, so it may not be 100%, but I think it is, that Quintez was targeted 94 times that season, and the next highest targeted receiver or player was Jake Ferguson, and it was like 47. It was half the targets, and that doesn't even include the 3 wide receivers that we're talking about. So, I mean, there's obviously different ways to skin a cat. They had a ton of success when you've got 2 wide receivers getting the bulk of the targets, but it makes it a hell of a lot harder to defend this many wide receivers that have this much talent. And the difference being that Wisconsin's going to be throwing the ball a lot more. I think it was when I was talking to Keontez Lewis, he had a smile on his face and he said, like, when we're on the field, we're going to air that thing out. And hard to disagree based on what we've seen.
What was the Bryson Green quote? We're going to pass it a lot, we're going to run it a lot, and we're going to win a lot. Something to that effect.
Yeah.
Which is why he was asked kind of why he decided to come to Wisconsin and whether it was a good fit and those first 2 things, but it's mostly about winning. I think they're going to win a lot too. I think they're also going to pass it a lot. I think they're going to run it a lot. So I'm on board with absolutely everything he said in that quote. All right. We've got some more to get to here. Christopher asks, what position group should we be most concerned about as far as depth?
Oh, to me, this is an easy, well, tight end is where I'll go, although I kind of want to say punter.
They're not going to punt this year, Jesse. What's the point?
I mean, what am I even saying? There's no need for punting when you're going to score 75 points a game, clearly. It's tight end, and I think that's probably obvious because, like we've discussed, no Jack Eschenbach, no Clay Cundiff, and I think they're still trying to figure out how best to utilize those guys. I will say, Riley Nowakowski and Hayden Rucci have had pretty good preseasons. And I think when we were sitting there in the bleachers, you mentioned that you felt like Rucci had quietly had a really good preseason. He's catching the ball a lot more than he ever has. And, Jack Pugh's got the talent there. And Tucker Ashcraft, that kind of surprise, that may be the group that you end up seeing the most.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We know they have a bunch of outside linebackers. They don't have Nick Herbig. We know they have a bunch of defensive linemen. They don't have a Keanu Benton. We know they have a bunch of offensive linemen and the depth there. Wide receivers deep. You could make a case for running back just because the top 2, but then the third one, who's it going to be? Whether it's going to be Jackson Aker or K. Diacomelli. That maybe I could sit there and say, ooh, yikes. If those first 2 were to go down, could Jackson Aker be in there and be successful and be consistent and all that comes along with having to be a running back in this system? But tight end probably makes the most sense. I'd maybe say tight end and then running back for me.
Yeah, the running back one makes sense for a couple different reasons. And I think part of it is just the injury history that both those guys have had. It's not that Braylon has missed a lot, but we know that he's
dinged up. Yeah.
Really had to work to get through the season. And he did miss a game last year, came back, had a nice bounce back game in the bowl, but you lose one of those and everything changes. Jackson Aker is a very good, versatile player, but we're talking about Braylon, who's one of the best running backs in the country coming into the season, and Ches, who teamed with Braylon, I think as good of a duo as there is in the country. So that would make a substantial difference.
Yeah, it's a really good 1-2 duo for sure. And hopefully for Wisconsin's sake, they're able to stay healthy. That's been the one hiccup for them during their time at Wisconsin. Both of them have been ultra productive, and we'll see. Ches Malusi obviously still dealing with a little bit of the after effects of that hit. Was he's still in a no contact jersey? Is that what Luke Fickell said on Saturday? Didn't ask.
Didn't get to that question.
All right. Moving on here. Grant asks, and I guess this kind of goes a little bit of the tight end thing that I should have asked before. Do you see Chris Brooks Jr. slotting in at tight end in some situations given his frame?
I've gotten that question a lot. At this point, I'm inclined to say no, largely because I haven't seen it. But again, that doesn't mean that won't be something that the coaches consider. He's obviously got the physicality and the length. And right now he's in a spot where he's not going to get a ton of reps in the game based on the way the top 2 lines have gone. But I think we know that the staff is willing to be creative with the different ways it can utilize people. I would just say that it's not something that we have seen at all. That doesn't mean they won't consider it if it's best for the team.
Yeah, for sure. Couple more here. Adam asks, do we have a strong sense of who will do kickoff and punt returns?
Well, We got one of those answers from Fickell on Saturday. He was asked, I mean, there's a lot of wide receivers that are in that return group, and does he want a number one, or would he prefer to have multiple guys? And one of the things he said specifically about punt return is that if the season began tomorrow, it would likely be Chimere Dike, which makes sense because it's a role that he's handled. The kick return thing, he didn't specify. I think that may be a little bit more of a work in progress. Feels like an awful lot to have DK be your number one as a punt returner, as a kick returner, and then on the one line at wide receiver. That's not to say it won't happen. I think they do have some good options, and the ones that we've seen consistently just in the return game in general are all wide receivers, really. CJ Williams, Will Pauling, Vinny Anthony, Chimere Dike, and I'm forgetting one. Who am I forgetting? Or is that all of them?
Not Bryson, right?
No, not Bryson. That may be the four.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know you can't play scared.
Skylar Bell. That's the other one.
I know you can't play scared, and football is a contact game and all that good stuff, all the macho things you want to say, but I will never put a top receiver, unless he's Devin Hester or Deion Sanders as a returner. I'm not putting my number one receiver back, whether it's returning punts or returning kicks. I don't see the value in it. Unless he's just a ridiculously good returner. Jared Aberderis was a really, really good returner, right? And he put him back there, and he was great. Jim Leonard, great returner. He very valuable to their defense, but a really great returner and can change the game with what he's able to do as a return man. I just don't see it with. I shouldn't say I don't see it with Chimere. If he is that, okay, but I'm not a fan of putting your top receiver back in those spots.
Would you argue that the difference in the top couple guys is negligible and therefore put somebody else back there? I mean, but the thing is, most of those guys are part of the rotation and going to get significant snaps. So what are you to do?
Honestly, I'm putting Vinny Anthony back kicking on kick returns and somebody else to go and call for a fair catch on punts. But again, that's the worrisome thing in my own mind, and that's not how football coaches think. It's not how football players think. It's not how things actually go. I just personally have never seen the value in it unless you're an amazing returner and can change the game, because that's how good you are. That's just me. All right, moving on here. This is kind of a bigger picture question. Joseph says, how does the team look compared to other years? Obviously, we know the changes. But are we going to be good? The talent level higher than normal? And another one goes along with this. CP says, how does this team's talent appear to stack up with some of the more successful rosters of yesteryear, 2011, 2017? Is it too early to tell if this team has what it takes to be capable of knocking off an OSU and making some noise?
Yes. This is such an impossible question to answer, and this does come up every now and then. It's natural to want to make comparisons. First of all, we're comparing it to any other team of yesteryear. What we're comparing it to didn't exist then, so it's kind of an apples to oranges thing. In terms of the offense and what to expect. Like I don't have a basis for comparison because I have not seen this before at Wisconsin. But I can understand the comparisons in terms of what a win total and what success may look like and whether you're good enough to beat Ohio State. It's just really hard for me right now when you're asking, how does it stack up to this ex-Wisconsin team? I'm not going to say any team is better than the 2011 team right now, because 9 of the 11 starters on offense were NFL draft picks. I mean,
go position by position, right? Go quarterback, 2011, running back, 2011. Are you disagreeing with that?
Not at all.
Okay. All right. That's like
offensive line. Somebody here is going to have to prove it to me that they're on that level this year.
Tight ends, 2011. Wide receivers, depth-wise, I think you could say that. But top two, with Aberderis and Nick Toon, that's that group. Look at that. That offense is insane. It's also why they scored 40-some-odd points a game.
And lost 3 games. So maybe the defense this year is going to be better.
That's why I wanted to go to the other side of the ball, because I think there are some things on the other side of the ball. You could say, I'd take this year's defense over that. Certainly. Maybe not inside linebacker. Maybe not with Chris Borland and Mike Taylor. Yeah. Pretty good players there for sure. Defensive line, you could make an argument one way or the other. Louis Nzegu was there and Bo Allen was there, and but they were not a great defense by any stretch. They got gashed by a number of teams, but offensively, that's going to be almost impossible to top at any point. Like if Luke Fickell gets the offense and Phil Long gets the offense to be like that,
yeah,
that will be ridiculous. Because I
cash
think
your playoff tickets.
Yes, because I think they're going to be able to keep things going the way they have on defense for the last decade. I think it's going to stay at a really, really high level. 2017 is probably a little bit different. I'm taking that 2017 defense almost over anybody, right? You go back and look at the names on that defense. It's really darn good. Really, really darn good. And offensively, I mean, Alex Hornibrook was your quarterback. Threw a lot of touchdowns.
Pretty good season.
Threw a lot of touchdowns. Threw a lot of interceptions.
Yep.
Threw a lot of interceptions that year. But Jonathan Taylor, obviously, you're going to take that at running back. You're going to take this wide receiver group. I mean, they were coming along, though, in 2017, right? Quintez was coming along, and some of the younger guys were coming along, and Danny Davis as a freshman. They were actually that was a pretty good wide receiver room in 2017. And offensive line-wise, it was a pretty good offensive line, too. So I think there's maybe some comparisons you could make between the two.
Yeah.
Defensively, though, they were amazing. And it's outside of the 2021 defense, I think the 2017 defense is probably the best in this era of 3-4.
Well,
2016 was pretty good too.
2021 gave up like 65 yards rushing a game now.
I said that. I said 2021.
Oh, okay.
Outside of 2021, 2017 is probably the best.
Yeah. But if the question is Wisconsin going to be good? My answer would be yes. I'm just going to be real. I'm never going to pick Wisconsin in a game against Ohio State until I see the Badgers actually win. It's just how I am. I've been covering them since 2011, which means I was not here for 2010 and therefore have never seen Wisconsin beat Ohio State, even though the Badgers have been close. And that offense this year, I expect Ohio State to be extremely explosive. Like their number 2 or their slot guy would be the best wide receiver on every other team, it feels like. I mean, that one's tough for me to say that Wisconsin's going to win that, but that doesn't mean the Badgers aren't going to be really good and really entertaining this year. But I know you disagree, which is good for the show.
It's not even just a disagreement. It's just a feel. It's not I feel great about it. And if I'm being completely honest here, I maybe feel less good about it after watching 8 practices, which is completely unfair because it's the first 8 practices of fall camp and so much can happen. But I'm sticking with it. I don't care. I'm going to own it because no one's going to remember if I am wrong, but they're going to remember if I'm right.
I'll bring it up.
Isn't that how it always goes? Like no one remembers usually the things that like this isn't like I'm not posting this and saying Ohio State, come listen to this, come watch this, eat it up and come back and blow it up in my face when Wisconsin gets hammered at home by Ohio State, which hasn't happened since. Can you name the last time Wisconsin got blown out at home by Ohio State? I can't.
Well, it's definitely before my time covering them. So.
The closest, I mean, I think it probably 1995, maybe, when it was Eddie George. But even that game, I think, was close, if I'm remembering correctly. It hasn't happened. It doesn't happen. In Madison, it just doesn't happen. So if it's close, why not pick Wisconsin? That's my feeling with it. Again, whole new thing, whole new stretch, whole new staff and all that good stuff. And so maybe it's going to be different, but I'm going with it. I'm going with history here. A couple more we got. I know I keep on saying that. Future Badger asks, do you think Darian Dupree and Dylan Jones will be the top 2 running backs next year, or do you see Jackson Aker as the main guy? And yes, I'm talking about 2024 with guys that are not even here, and I'm putting you on the spot anyways.
I'm just going to say no.
Okay. I think here's the thing, though. I don't think they're going to go to next year without a veteran running back. I think the transfer portal, they're going to add something in the transfer portal through at running back for sure. Just, I know they're bringing in 3. I get that in the class. I certainly understand that. But if Jackson Aker doesn't do anything big this year, if he doesn't get a ton of carries, or if it's Cade Giacomelli doesn't get a bunch of carries, they can't go into that year unless they just feel amazing about those 2 guys. There's no way you can go into next year without a veteran.
Well, it always comes down to numbers and who's available. And if everybody were to we're basically talking about 3 guys, and Cade Yakimelli, Jackson Aker, and then Nate White, and you bring in 3. Are you willing to have 7 scholarship running backs? You would be if the one you bring in is a difference maker.
Right.
Right now, it's hard for me to sit here and say your top 2 running backs are going to be true freshmen who haven't even started their senior seasons of high school, but they're tremendously talented. And I think we should also just make sure we get to December and everybody has signed. I think that is, at this point, reasonable to just watch how it plays out.
Are you trying to say that Darian Dupree may not end up being in Wisconsin?
I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying nothing is over until it's official.
Right. For sure. But I just don't see Wisconsin going to next year without a veteran running back there. Yeah. So either way, whether those 2 guys are the top running backs around, I don't know that. But I do think there's going to be some other names added to that room that we don't know right now. So last one. Frank says, do you see the preferred walk-on program being less relevant in the future if the recruiting trends in the right direction?
Here's where I think the difference comes in is, remember what Barry Alvarez and Brett Bielema used to say all the time, is that the walk-ons, the in-state guys, they considered to be erasers for mistakes that you would make in recruiting. You know what that is now? The transfer portal. That's not to say walk-ons aren't still going to be relevant and important. I think Luke Fickell and the staff understand the value of the in-state kids. And I know we've talked about this ad nauseum here the last couple months when it came to scholarship in-state recruits and how much a coach values having local guys and how much they're willing to put into it with the time and the effort. But I also think when you're evaluating your roster every year, and you're going to lose more players than you ever have because of the transfer portal, but you're also going to bring them in. So you're evaluating mistakes in recruiting or holes based on the transfer portal. So that is my, I'd say, biggest concern in how it relates to the walk-on program. But for a place like Wisconsin, with the type of kids and the hardworking guys that are willing to come here for no money and work their ass off and potentially contribute, a lot of guys that have done that over the years, that hang on walls and they make banners and shirts for. And so I think it's still going to be a valuable part. I think it is going to be a little bit different.
I think it's also going to has become different because of how the state is viewed nationally, and more teams coming into Wisconsin and taking talent out of the state and giving them scholarships and taking the talent out of the state. Yeah. And so maybe there's not as many guys left over that are willing to come in and do what you just said. I'm not saying that they aren't, or that there won't be a few here and there, but I think more often than not these days, with the way Wisconsin is starting to be viewed, especially high school football wise, there may not be as many guys available to come in and do it. Like, does Joe Schobert have a scholarship somewhere else? If he is entering the portal, or not the portal, but entering college now, I think he probably does. And Jim Leonard, as talented of an athlete as he is in small little town up there, does he have an opportunity to go somewhere else? Maybe. I know it's still probably just his size maybe would have kept him down, but like a MAC school wouldn't have come in and offered him now. There are a number of guys throughout this last 30 years that ended up in Wisconsin that maybe not would end up in Wisconsin now, just because of the view of how Wisconsin football, high school football is right now.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Joe Schobert, because his was the name that was coming to mind right before you said it. I think it was it North Dakota or North Dakota State?
North Dakota State.
Only a couple days before that he ended up coming to Wisconsin because the Badgers wanted him. It's tough. I still think that it can be hard to find guys in some of those rural parts of the state where they're not going to camps and they're not recognized as much. On the other hand, you look at some of those recruiting rankings and just guys who are getting offers, and if Wisconsin doesn't offer them, there's a MAC school that's going to come in there. Now, question is, are these kids going to be willing, like a lot have in the past, to forego potential scholarship money to a lower level program to stay in the state? I still think you're going to get that, but to what degree, that remains to be seen.
And you make another good point, and I should have said that not just because of the way Wisconsin high school football is viewed, but because these kids are going to these camps and going to these camps all over the place, and social media as well, be able to get their tape out there. I don't know if your Twitter feed is like this, but how many players like from all around the country just start following you because they're trying to get their name out there.
Yep.
Wisconsin may not have any contact with them whatsoever. They may not have any connection whatsoever to Wisconsin, but they're trying to get their name out there. And that's what social media has been able to do. And I think that's another aspect of guys not necessarily getting underneath or going under the radar anymore because of the camps and the way Wisconsin high school football is viewed and social media. They're able to force stuff into people's faces. This isn't Chris Borland's brother getting taped to Wisconsin, to get him. And then he comes to a camp and Brett Bielema offers him right away. Like, this is a little bit different. So, all right, Wisconsin is having a little bit of a scrimmage on Sunday that we will not get to see, but it's going to be a scrimmage situation. And then we get to talk to the quarterbacks. Me and Jess will be back on Monday. We'll break it down and hear what Tanner Mordecai and Braden Locke and Phil Longo and all those guys had to say as well. We'll talk about that. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.